Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Research Fantasy Presents our NBA Fantasy Baller DFS edition, where we're breaking down all of the playoff matchups on the slate for tonight. My name is Nick from CWE on all of your favorite daily fantasy sites, and as I said, we're breaking down the slates for Monday, April 24th, 2017. This first round is starting to wrap itself up. I say that as we have one team already locked in for the next round, that being the Cleveland Cavaliers. Tonight, Golden State looks to do the same thing to Portland, and we have a few other series that are closing in as well. None of them on the slate this evening, but we could walk away from this with, we will walk away from this with a 3-2 lead. In the first game we discussed, we could see a 3-1 lead in the second game. So we're definitely headed in the right direction. Let's start off with Milwaukee and Toronto. This has been a really close series thus far. We've had two games that have been pretty low scoring, two games that have been pretty high scoring. The series shifts back to Toronto tonight. The road game hasn't been a factor for either team. We've really seen both teams play fine on the road. I want to say Toronto has the advantage here, but I really don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think at this point, this series is up in the air. It's not necessarily a favorite to one team or another, which is kind of unusual for where Toronto found themselves seated. Now, looking at the Milwaukee side of things, we're not going to be able to look at a slate and not have Giannis Antetokounmpo be one of the players on Milwaukee that we can't fathom using. The playoffs, I know they can be a little strange. It's tough to figure out exactly how the usage comes into play and all that. But Antetokounmpo, one of the guys that has 60 to 70 plus upside on a slate like this, so it's a situation I don't want to avoid. Behind him, Chris Middleton, Greg Monroe, our next two options. Prices are obviously finally static now that, we have a couple of games into the playoffs and FanDuel made the decision to kind of bump pricing to the point where 5x is the hope, but no longer a realistic expectation for a lot of these players. So don't mind having some exposure to either of those guys. Malcolm Brogdon hasn't really been playing that well, but he's a guy I think just due to the time he sees you have to consider. Outside of that, Tony Snell, I told you from get-go that he's going to have a couple of games this series between 22 and 30 fantasy points. Finally hit that marker on, I believe, Saturday night, hitting for 22.8 fantasy points. So, another guy I just kind of don't mind, but I'm not going way out of my way to play him. On the Toronto side of things, DeMar DeRozan is our main target here. He's a scoring machine. That's what his entire role on this Raptors team is at this point. He's the only one that's really trustworthy. I know he did have an 0-for-9 game, and we've only played 4 games, but 75% success rate in terms of not having awful output is something you're going to have to take at this point in the playoffs. He's a guy that I don't mind building around either tonight. Kyle Lowry, Serge Ibaka, still the 2-3 behind him. Both of those guys still have upside in tournament settings. Really don't know which one more than the other, to be completely honest with you. I'm going to kind of side with Serge Ibaka because he's got a lower price point, therefore less has to be done to get him to that point. Jonas Valanciunas is now kind of a complete afterthought on this team. He's sitting on the bench playing 22 minutes a game. Norman Powell makes an interesting play here because he does more offensively than either DeMar Carroll or PJ Tucker, so that I get the gist that they wanted more offense in a smaller player on the floor, and that's why Jonas had to go to the bench, but it still kind of seems a little bit weird to me. Moving on from there, Washington at Atlanta. Washington up 2-1. I was kind of shocked that Atlanta beat them, but truthfully, Atlanta has been keeping this series pretty close, so it's not overly surprising. John Wall has just been an absolute monster. Probably the most consistent player throughout the playoffs on any team thus far, so he's the guy I want here. Behind him, it's tough because you've got everybody from Markieff to Marcin Gortat to Bradley Beal, putting up good games here and there, but not consistently. And when they're disappearing, they're disappearing. Otto Porter looks like he has a bit of a neck issue. He's probable. He's seeing minutes in the mid-20s. We've seen Kelly Oubre see a few more minutes. He's a punt option at best. The same goes for Brandon Jennings. I think we've seen his minutes and his output kind of tick up a little bit as the playoff series goes on. He's a guy I don't mind looking at if you're looking to differentiate your lineups while understanding that the probability of him having a successful fantasy game where he breaks 25 or 30 fantasy points like he did in the regular season is pretty slim. On from there to Atlanta, it's the Dennis Schroeder, Paul Millsap show. Don't see a reason to pivot off of either of those guys. In case you haven't noticed, Dwight Howard is absolutely invisible, making the Hawks, I'm sure, wonder what they got themselves into with his contract. And this is a guy that actually played reasonably well for the vast majority of the year, so it's a little bit shocking and disheartening to see that when it counts, Dwight Howard is nowhere to be found. Is there anyone else you can put in from the Atlanta Hawks? Taurean Prince at his price has the potential to come up with a 5x performance. Outside of that, the bench minutes are like, this bench rotation has one of the biggest rotations in the playoffs at this point, so I don't really like the idea of throwing guys out there for 8 minutes because, in case you didn't realize it takes a lot to get a big fantasy score in 8 minutes, and these aren't the types of players that really can do that. So I'm limiting my exposure. Like I said, I don't think you're doing it wrong if you base your teams around Schroeder and Millsap and kind of try to build from there, because I think there's some relative safety. Finally, we go to Portland, Golden State at Portland. The Warriors look to close things out. I'm reasonably confident that that's what's going to happen here. To me, the Warriors just that much of a better team than the Blazers. That's not to say the Blazers might not take one of these games, but I'm just not necessarily a believer here. Big question mark on the whole slate. Is Kevin Durant playing? I don't know if it's really that big of a question mark if I am whoever's in charge now. Steve Kerr obviously not with the team. Hope he gets well soon. Something seems bigger than what it is being reported in terms of his illness, because this is now a couple of times I feel like this year and maybe a couple years in total where Steve Kerr has missed some time. So you kind of really wonder, like, is there something that they're not telling us? But I wouldn't see the need to rush Durant back. You have a 3-0 lead in the series. You can call it shady. You can call it whatever you want. But at the end of the day, if you could get Durant a couple of extra days rest to move into the next series, you absolutely should. That being said, Draymond Green, triple-double alert every night. Portland not very good with bigs as it is. Not saying Draymond is a normal big, but he's got a lot of upside in this series. Stephen Curry has to be relied upon to score without Durant. Clay is actually the guy I'm least interested in, probably out of anybody on this slate. I just think the price versus return on your investment is not happening at this point, so I prefer to just move on. JaVale McGee is kind of turning things on a little bit. His price is still at a point where he's a reasonable, I don't know if you want to use differentiation option, but he's now had 2 consecutive 20-point games. And then beyond that, Andre Iguodala, priced up, but we know that Iguodala has some upside. If this game happens to stay close, he's a guy who could end up doing a little bit more for you. On the flip side of things, if Portland wants to stay in this, it's going to be the CJ McCollum and Damian Lillard show. Probably Lillard more than McCollum. McCollum's price makes me feel incredibly uncomfortable because he doesn't do as much as Lillard does, so it's harder for him to accumulate points. And with you only needing like 7 more points from Lillard than McCollum, I just can't fathom a reason, unless you think they're both going to have just enormous games, to play McCollum as well as Lillard. I'm all over Lillard, probably not so much on McCollum. Outside of those guys, we know that Nurkic is out for this game. Vonleh sees more minutes. He's worth a punt, but he's not my favorite guy because I just don't think he's a very good basketball player. Outside of that, Evan Turner, Al-Farouq Aminu, those are guys you could potentially consider as well. Price on Turner's come up a little bit, so he's not as attractive an option, but he's doing pretty well with everything that is going on there. All right, that wraps it up for today. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Head over to researchfantasy.com, sign up for our NBA mailing list, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Research and Win, and join us again tomorrow.